The wind that evening came crawling over the plains like a living thing, carrying the scent of dust, pine, and distant rain. The sun had just dipped behind the rocky ridges, and the sky burned a deep orange before fading into blue-gray dusk. Coyotes had started their mournful songs somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, and the sound rolled across the empty fields where a lone ranch house stood against the dying light. Inside, a man sat beside a half-burning fire, his rough hands folded. As he stared at the flames that threw restless shadows on the walls, his boy slept in the next room, a faint snore breaking the quiet. It was another long, lonely evening on the edge of nowhere. He had grown used to silence after losing his wife 2 winters back. The ranch kept him alive but hollowed him out. Every creak of the porch, every gust of wind under the door reminded him of what used to be. A woman's soft laughter, the smell of bread, the comfort of another voice in the house. Now it was just him, his son, and the old mare tied out back. He didn't expect visitors anymore. Folks rarely passed this far west unless they were lost, desperate, or running from something. That night, as the firelight dimmed, a sudden knock came at the door. It wasn't the polite kind, more like a hurried pounding, sharp and uneven. He froze for a second, thinking maybe it was a coyote scratching, but the next thump was unmistakably human. He reached for his rifle leaning near the wall, the barrel catching the fire's glow, and opened the door just enough to see. Rain had begun to fall, light but cold, and there on the porch stood a woman wrapped in a dark soaked shawl. Her eyes caught the firelight, wide, wary, and tired. She wasn't local, that much he knew at first glance. Her skin was sun-dark, her hair long and black, braided tight, her clothes rough and torn from travel. She looked like she had walked for days. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to hide fear. "I only need a place for the night. I'll leave at first light." He hesitated. It wasn't common to find an Apache woman this close to white settlements, not unless trouble had driven her there. But something in her eyes, something raw and desperate, made him lower the rifle. He motioned her inside. The woman stepped past him, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor, glancing around like she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice. He offered her a place by the fire, poured her a cup of black coffee, and watched her from the corner of his eye. She didn't speak for a while, only held her hands close to the flames, shivering quietly. Her wrists bore faint red marks, as if she'd been bound not long ago. When he noticed, he looked away, pretending not to have seen. He wasn't a man to pry into another's pain. His boy stirred in the next room and came out rubbing his eyes. The woman turned, startled, then softened when she saw the small child clutching a worn blanket. The boy smiled sleepily at her, unafraid. She smiled back, a gentle, fleeting smile that seemed to lift years of weariness from her face. The father noticed, and something inside him stirred too, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion, maybe, or pity. "You can sleep near the fire," he said finally, breaking the silence. "It gets cold at night. There's bread on the table. You'll be safe here." She nodded, whispering a quiet, "Thank you." Then, almost in a whisper he barely caught, she added, "You shouldn't have opened your door tonight." The words hung in the air, strange and uneasy. He didn't ask what she meant. He only stoked the fire higher and went to check the latch on the window. Outside, the rain turned heavier, and thunder rumbled across the plains. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed, a lonely, echoing sound. He looked through the curtain, but saw nothing except the black stretch of night and the faint flicker of lightning revealing the shapes of the trees. Inside, the woman sat still, her gaze fixed on the flames as if seeing something in them only she could understand. Her shawl slipped from her shoulder, revealing a deep bruise near her collarbone. He saw it and pretended again not to notice. Whoever she was, life hadn't been kind to her. He wanted to ask where she was from, what she was running from, but something about her silence warned him not to. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. So he let her be, sitting by the fire until his eyes grew heavy. Before turning in, he said, "You'll be gone by sunrise?" She looked up slowly. "If the road lets me," That answer wasn't what he expected, but he left it there. He lay in bed, listening to the rain and the creak of the fire settling. He thought about her words again. You shouldn't have opened your door. He wondered if she meant danger, or guilt, or simply that he was too kind for his own good. He didn't know that while he slept out beyond the tree line, shadows moved through the rain. Riders. Slow. Silent. Patient. The woman didn't sleep. She sat awake all night, staring into the firelight with eyes that didn't blink much. Every sound outside made her flinch. The rain, the wind, the hoot of an owl. They all carried warning to her ears. She reached into her bundle and took out something wrapped in leather. When she unfolded it, a small silver necklace fell into her palm. A child's trinket, broken but precious. She held it close, her fingers trembling, then tucked it back quickly as if hiding a piece of her heart. She whispered something in her native tongue. A prayer, or maybe an apology. By dawn, the storm had passed. The man woke to the sound of crackling embers and the smell of damp air. The woman was standing by the window, her shawl already tied, her hair wet and loose over her shoulders. She turned to him when he rose. "Thank you for the shelter," she said softly. "I'll be gone before your boy wakes." He wanted to stop her, to ask if she had somewhere to go, but before he could speak, a noise came from outside. Hoofbeats, not one horse but several. Heavy, purposeful. The kind that made the ground thrum. Her eyes widened. His hand went instinctively to his rifle. "You expecting anyone?" she asked sharply. "No," he said, "not in months." She grabbed her bundle, her breath quickening. "Then you need to hide me." He frowned. "Hide you? From who?" Before she could answer, the sound grew nearer, the muffled voices of men shouting faintly through the trees. The boy stirred in the back room, half awake. The woman looked toward him, then back to the father. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking this time. "They'll kill me if they find me here." He stared at her for a long second, torn between sense and mercy. The law in these parts didn't often favor folks like her, and anyone harboring her could be accused of worse. But there was something in her eyes, fear mixed with fierce dignity, that made his gut twist. She wasn't just running from trouble, she was running for her life. "Get behind the barn," he said finally. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards. Go now." She didn't wait for another word. She darted out the back as he stepped to the front door, rifle ready. Through the open crack, he saw 3 riders approaching, their coats dark with mud, their eyes searching. The lead rider raised his hand in greeting but didn't smile. "Mornin'," the stranger said, rain dripping off his hat brim. "We're looking for an Apache woman, escaped from custody 2 days ago. You seen anyone pass through here?" The father's grip tightened on the rifle. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The riders waited, rainwater pooling around their boots, the smell of wet leather heavy in the air. Behind the house, under the earth, the woman held her breath, clutching the little silver trinket to her chest, as muffled voices filled the morning. And in that tense silence, one question lingered in both their minds. How long before truth broke through the door? The man stood still at the doorway, his thumb resting near the trigger of his rifle as the riders scanned the yard. The rain had turned the soil to soft mud, and the horses shifted uneasily, steam rising from their flanks. The man's pulse thudded in his ears, but he kept his face calm. He knew how to hide fear. Life on the frontier had taught him that much. The lead rider, tall and broad with a badge pinned under his slicker, squinted at him. "You live here alone?" he asked. "With my boy," the man said evenly. "Ain't seen anyone pass through since the last cattle drive." The rider studied him a moment, then leaned forward in the saddle. "We got reason to believe she might head this way. Apache woman. Dangerous. Wanted for attacking a patrol and fleeing custody. You see her, you send word down to the post." The man nodded once. "I will." The rider stared at him another second, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Then he gave a curt nod and turned his horse. The others followed, hooves sloshing through puddles as they disappeared back down the trail toward the hills. The man waited until their shadows were gone behind the cottonwoods before lowering his rifle. His hand was still shaking when he set it down. He went out back and lifted the hatch to the root cellar. The woman crouched inside, her eyes wide in the dim light. When he motioned that it was safe, she climbed out slowly, brushing dirt from her shawl. "They're gone," he said, keeping his voice low. "But they'll be back this way soon enough." She stood silent for a long time, breathing fast, her face pale against her dark hair. "You lied for me," she said softly. "I don't take kindly to strangers bringing trouble to my door," he answered. "But I also don't hand a woman over to men with guns unless I know the whole story." Her eyes met his then, fierce and steady. "You wouldn't believe the story if I told you." He poured her some water and handed it over. "Try me." She hesitated, glancing toward the fields beyond the barn. "They call me dangerous," she said after a pause. "But I didn't kill anyone. I only ran. They took everything from my people. Our land, our homes, even the children. I was taken after a raid near the San Pedro Valley. They said it was to keep me safe, but safety in chains is no safety at all." He watched her carefully as she spoke, every word weighted with something more than pain, something closer to defiance. "You escaped," he said quietly. "I did," she replied. "I've been running ever since. I had a son once. He was taken during the march south. I don't even know if he's alive. Those men," she added, nodding toward the trail, "they hunt me because I won't go back to the camps. They want to make an example of me." The man felt something twist inside him. He thought of his own wife, how sickness had taken her, how helpless he'd felt watching her slip away. Loss had a way of making people kin, even when their worlds were different. He looked at the woman again, not as a fugitive, but as someone who had lost everything too. "You can stay till dark," he said finally. "Then I'll ride you partway through the canyons. You'll be safer moving after sundown." She nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief, though her eyes stayed watchful. "Thank you," she murmured. "You don't owe me anything, but I'll remember your kindness." He turned to go inside. But something about her words stayed with him. The way she said remember, like she carried a promise heavier than her pack. The rest of the day passed under gray skies. The man went about his chores with the quiet patience of habit, feeding the stock, fixing a fence, hauling wood. But his thoughts kept circling back to the woman. Every now and then he saw her near the corral, standing still, watching the horizon like someone expecting ghosts to ride out of it. His boy followed her once, curious, and she smiled at him the way only someone with a gentle heart could. She knelt beside him, showing him how to braid a strand of grass into a circle. The boy laughed, and for the first time in a long while, the man heard laughter around his home again. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to a faint silver hue, he found her sitting by the creek. She was humming a tune he didn't recognize. Soft, low, the kind of melody that spoke of old grief. He sat nearby, letting the quiet fill the space between them. "Your wife," she said suddenly without looking at him. "She's gone." He blinked, surprised she knew. "How'd you figure that?" "The way your boy looks at you," she said. "Like you're the only light left. That kind of look only comes when half the world is missing." He nodded slowly. "Fever took her 2 winters ago. Left me with the ranch, the boy, and a hole in my chest that won't close." The woman turned her face to the water, her expression unreadable. "Then you know what it means to keep going when there's nothing left to keep you." They sat quiet after that, listening to the creek and the wind. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled again. He noticed her hands shaking slightly as she clutched the shawl tighter. "They'll be looking for you still," he said. "Those men aren't the kind to give up easy." "I know," she whispered. "They've been hunting me since spring. Every time I stop, I see their tracks in the dirt not long after. I thought maybe if I crossed into ranch country, they'd lose the trail." She looked up at him, her eyes full of that same stubborn fire. "I was wrong." The man stared into the darkening fields. "If they come back," he said, "they won't find you." "I'll make sure of that." She looked at him startled. "Why would you risk that? You barely know me." He met her gaze. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. Because no one deserves to be hunted for just trying to live." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them held a quiet understanding, unspoken but solid. When they returned to the cabin, night had fallen thick and heavy. The fire inside flickered, throwing light across the walls. The boy was already asleep, his small hand clutching the edge of the blanket. The woman crouched beside him for a moment, watching his peaceful face, and something in her eyes softened. A mix of sorrow and tenderness. She whispered something under her breath, maybe a prayer for the child, before sitting back by the fire. The man poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "You'll need to leave before dawn," he said quietly. "I'll ride you as far as the ridge. From there, the trail splits toward the mountains. You can lose them in the canyons if you keep east." She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the cup for warmth. "There's something you should know," she said after a pause. "Those men, they're not just soldiers. One of them, he's the one who killed my husband." The man froze, the words hitting like a bullet. She stared into the fire as she spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "They came to our village saying it was for peace. My husband didn't fight them. He tried to reason. But when he refused to hand over our land markers, they shot him in front of everyone. I was taken that night. I escaped a week later. Since then, I've been running from the same man who took everything from me." The man swallowed hard, anger burning in his chest. "And now he's got the law on his side." "Yes," she said bitterly. "And I'm the outlaw." The cabin fell silent again. Outside, wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters. The man knew now there was no easy way out of this. If he helped her, he'd be breaking the law. But if he didn't, he'd be betraying the part of himself that still believed in decency. He looked at her across the firelight, the lines of exhaustion on her face, the courage it took just to sit there, and something in him settled. He couldn't turn her away. "You get some rest," he said finally. "We'll move before sunrise." She nodded and lay near the hearth, her breathing slow but uneven. The man sat awake long after, staring into the dying fire, listening to the rain start again. Every sound outside felt sharper now, every creak of the barn door or cry of a night bird pulling at his nerves. When he finally rose to check the window, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a flicker of movement among the trees, a lantern swinging slowly, then another. He counted 3, they were back. He turned toward the hearth where the woman lay asleep, unaware of what was coming. The boy stirred in his bed, and the wind carried the faint jingle of bridles from the darkness beyond the porch. The man's hand went to his rifle again as he whispered to himself. They found her, and before the first knock even came, he knew the night ahead would change everything. The first knock came slow and heavy, shaking the door on its hinges. The man's heart hammered against his ribs as he moved silently across the floor, rifle in hand. The woman was already awake, her eyes wide and alert. Without a word, he motioned for her to move behind the hearth where the shadows fell thick. She understood instantly, slipping out of sight just as another knock echoed through the cabin, louder this time. The boy stirred in his bed, murmuring softly, and the man whispered a quick prayer that he wouldn't wake. "Evening again," came the voice from outside, smooth but with an edge that chilled the air. "Sorry to bother you twice in one day."
"Mind if we come in?"
The man's grip tightened on the rifle. "It's late," he called back, his voice steady but rough. "Ain't got much to offer, and the boy's asleep." The voice laughed faintly. "We ain't here for supper, friend. Just making sure you're not sheltering someone you shouldn't be. Word came from the fort she's close. Real close." The man swallowed, stepping nearer the door. "You already checked here once," he said. "You think I'd lie?" There was a pause outside. Then came the sound of boots shifting in the mud. "Mind if we take a look around anyway?" Orders from the captain. He hesitated. Any refusal would make them suspicious. But if they stepped inside, one look toward the firelight could expose her. He thought fast. "If you got orders," he said, "best come back in daylight. Ain't safe wandering through ranch country in the dark. Too many holes, too many snakes." That earned another chuckle. "You let us worry about that." The latch rattled. He stepped forward quickly, pressing his weight against the door. "You set foot in my home without cause," he said, voice low. "You'll regret it." There was silence. Long, cold silence. Then the voice turned sharp. "You sure you want to be on the wrong side of this? Harboring a fugitive is hanging offense, even for a man with a boy to raise." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and he prayed the man would walk away. Finally, after a moment that felt endless, the sound of spurs faded back toward the trees. The horses shifted. A command was given quietly and the riders moved off. He waited a full minute before lowering the rifle. When he finally turned around, the woman was still crouched in the shadows, her hands trembling. "They're not giving up," she whispered. "He's out there with them." I heard his voice. The man frowned. "Who?" "The one who killed my husband," she said, her voice barely a breath. "He'll burn everything down before he lets me go." He looked at her face in the flicker of firelight and saw raw terror mixed with something fierce. Survival. She wasn't running from fear alone. She was running from vengeance too. He thought of the boy asleep in the back room. If those men searched the cabin and found her here, they'd take him too, or worse. He had to think fast. At dawn, the rain had stopped, but fog blanketed the land. The air was thick and still, and every sound seemed louder in the quiet. The woman packed what little she had while he saddled the mare. He handed her a small sack of food and a wool blanket. "There's a trail behind the ridge," he said. "It'll take you to the river pass. Stay off the main road. They'll be looking there first." She looked at him hesitant. "You don't have to do this. They'll come back here again. If they find out you helped me," he cut her off gently. "You saved my boy's laughter last night. That's more than anyone's done in a long time. I'll take my chances." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, her eyes glistening, though she didn't let tears fall. As they rode out before sunrise, the plains stretched silent and endless before them. The fog curled around the trees like ghosts. The man led the way, keeping low, scanning for movement. The woman followed close behind, clutching the reins tightly. They rode for nearly 2 hours without a word until they reached the edge of a canyon. The ground dipped sharply and a narrow trail wound down into the mist. "This'll hide your tracks for a while," he said, dismounting. "Once you reach the river, follow it west till you hit the cliffs. There's an old trading post out there. The owner owes me a favor. Tell him I sent you." She nodded but didn't move to go. "You've done enough," she said softly. "Don't risk following me any farther." Before he could reply, a distant echo reached them, the unmistakable thud of hooves on wet ground. Multiple riders, coming fast. Her eyes widened. They found the trail. He looked back toward the ridge. The fog was parting, revealing the faint shimmer of movement through the trees. "Go," he said urgently. "Ride hard and don't stop till you reach the river." She hesitated for just a moment, then spurred her horse forward, disappearing down the canyon path. He turned his mare around and rode toward the ridge, the rifle ready across his saddle. He wasn't sure what he planned to do, stall them, maybe lead them off her trail, but something in him refused to stand by and watch her be hunted down. By the time the riders broke through the fog, he was waiting near the edge of the field, calm and steady as if he'd been working fence posts all morning. The lead man, the one with the badge, raised a hand to stop his men. "Morning again," the officer said coldly. "You're up early." "Ranch life don't wait on sunlight," the man replied. The officer's eyes narrowed. "We found fresh tracks near your barn. 2 horses, one of them smaller, barely rested. Where's the other rider?" He shrugged. "Traded a delivery at dawn. Farmer from the north side. Left before the fog set in." The officer smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't. "That's so. You wouldn't be lying, would you? Because that'd be mighty foolish with a child in the house." The man's grip on the reins tightened. "You best leave my boy out of this." The officer's smile vanished. "You think I won't search the property again?" He said nothing. The officer signaled to his men, and 2 of them rode off toward the barn. The man's pulse spiked, but he kept his face blank. If they found the second set of prints near the creek, it would be over. One of the riders called back after a few minutes. "Tracks head south. 2 horses, maybe an hour old." The officer turned to the man. "You sure that farmer was heading north?" He hesitated a second too long. The officer grinned darkly. "Thought so." He leaned forward in the saddle, lowering his voice. "You've got courage, I'll give you that. But courage don't count for much when the law comes calling." The man didn't flinch. "You call it law. I call it cruelty." The officer's expression hardened. "Cruelty's letting her live long enough to get people like you killed." He turned his horse. "You got one more chance to tell me which way she went." The man looked straight at him. "You're looking the wrong direction." The officer studied him for a long, quiet moment, then nodded to his men. "Fan out. We'll find her. And when we do, anyone that stood in our way will answer for it." They rode off, disappearing into the haze. The man stayed there until the sound of hooves faded. His hands shook when he finally lowered the rifle across his lap. Back in the canyon, the woman rode hard, the mare's hooves clattering against stone. Her lungs burned and the wind whipped her hair loose. Every turn of the trail felt too narrow, every echo of her own heartbeat too loud. She could almost feel the officer's presence behind her, the weight of his hatred like a shadow that refused to die. At one point, she slowed near a ridge and looked back. The fog was thinning, revealing a thin plume of smoke far off, his cabin. Her chest tightened. She knew he'd drawn their suspicion, maybe even their wrath. But if she turned back, it would undo everything. As she followed the river west, memories crept in. The day of the raid, the screams, the smell of smoke, her husband falling beside her. She remembered the officer's cold eyes as he pulled her away. She'd sworn then that if she ever escaped, she'd never stop running. But now, for the first time, she didn't want to keep running alone. Far above her, the man stood watching from the high ground. He could barely make out her figure through the morning mist, moving fast along the river bend. He knew she'd survive today, but the road ahead was long and filled with danger. Behind him, a distant gunshot cracked the silence. Then another. He turned toward the sound, his stomach twisting. Somewhere in that fog, the hunters had found their trail again. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. The gunshots echoed like thunder rolling through the canyon walls, each one sharper than the last. The man gripped his rifle tighter and looked toward the low valley where the river cut through the fog. The sound had come from that direction. His gut clenched. He knew what it meant. The riders had caught her trail. He kicked his mare into motion, racing down the slope, the wind tearing at his coat. Every instinct screamed that he was heading straight into danger, but he couldn't let her face them alone. Not after everything she'd been through. Not after what she'd already lost. The ground was slick from the rain, and the mare stumbled once, nearly throwing him, but he held tight and pressed on. The fog was lifting now, revealing the pale streaks of dawn stretching across the sky. He could see fresh tracks where her horse had passed, cutting along the edge of the river and into the trees. Then he saw something else. Hoofprints turning off from another direction, closing in fast. They were tracking her like hounds. He followed the sound of the water until he caught sight of movement through the brush. She was there, crouched beside her horse, trying to reload a small pistol with trembling hands. Her shawl was torn, and blood streaked her arm where a bullet had grazed her. "They're behind you!" he called out. She looked up sharply, eyes wide with relief and fear mixed together. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice shaking. "Couldn't leave you to face them alone," he answered, sliding off his horse and moving toward her. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said quickly. "They'll be here any minute." He glanced around, his eyes scanning the trees. The river curved sharply ahead, forming a narrow pass between two ridges. "We can make a stand there," he said. "If we can hold them off till dark, maybe they'll think we doubled back." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Together they led the horses toward the ridge. The air smelled of wet earth and gunpowder. Every twig that snapped underfoot made them flinch. Somewhere behind them came the faint crack of another gunshot. It was closer this time. They reached the narrow bend where the river's edge rose sharply into stone. The man crouched behind a fallen log and checked his rifle. His movements calm despite the storm brewing inside him. She knelt beside him, clutching her pistol, breathing hard. "If they find us," she said quietly, "don't let them take me alive." He turned to her, startled by the calm in her voice. "Don't talk like that," she met his eyes. "You don't know what they'll do. You don't know what that man will do." He saw it then, the raw terror behind her strength. He wanted to promise her safety, to tell her it would all end soon, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, he wasn't sure they'd both make it out. The sound of horses broke through the trees. The man raised his rifle, the woman steadied her pistol, and the tension in the air thickened until even the river seemed to hold its breath. Through the fog came the riders, 3 of them fanning out, rifles raised. The officer was in front, his hat pulled low, his expression hard as carved stone. "End of the line," the officer called out. "You've got nowhere left to run," the man shouted back. "She's done running." "Leave her be," the officer's voice turned cold. "She's a fugitive. You're a fool. Move aside before I decide you're both worth hanging." He didn't move. "You'll have to come take her." The officer smiled thinly. "Gladly." The first shot tore through the air, striking the log beside the man's head. He ducked, returning fire. The crack of rifles echoed through the canyon as birds scattered from the trees. The woman fired too, hitting one of the rider's saddles and sending his horse rearing. The animal threw its rider into the river. The officer cursed, signaling the others to circle wide. The man reloaded fast, his hand steady though his heart pounded. He could feel the heat of adrenaline, the burn of fear, but also something fierce rising inside him. A need to protect what was right, no matter the cost. He peeked out from cover just long enough to see the officer moving closer along the ridge, crouched low. The man fired again, hitting the dirt inches from the officer's boot. "Stop this madness!" The officer shouted. "You're throwing your life away for a savage." The words struck deep, but the man didn't waver. "She's got more honor than you'll ever understand." A bullet hit the log, splintering wood near his arm. He flinched but stayed put. The woman's pistol clicked empty. She tossed it aside, grabbing a fallen rifle from the ground. Her hands trembled as she aimed, and for a moment her eyes met his. There was something unspoken there, a quiet gratitude, a farewell that neither wanted to admit might be real. The officer's men began to flank them from both sides. The man knew they couldn't hold forever. He turned to her. "When I give the word, take the horses and ride through the canyon. Follow the river west. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You will if you want to live," he replied. "They want you, not me. If I draw them off, you'll have a chance." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You'd die for me?" He looked at her with a small, tired smile. "No, I'd die to make sure they don't win." Before she could answer, another volley of shots rang out. The man fired twice, forcing the officer's men to scatter. He grabbed the reins of her horse and slapped its flank, sending it bolting down the canyon path. She gasped, realizing what he'd done, and scrambled after it. "Don't!" she shouted, but he caught her arm. "Go," he said roughly. "That boy of mine still needs a father who did the right thing." Then he pushed her toward the horse and turned back to face the ridge. She hesitated only a moment before climbing on. As the horse leapt forward, she looked back and saw him standing tall against the smoke, rifle raised, defiant and alone. The image burned itself into her mind, the man who had risked everything for a stranger. The officer saw her break away and cursed, signaling one of his men to give chase. The man fired again, hitting the officer's horse. The animal screamed and fell, throwing its rider hard into the ground. The other stopped to help him, giving her a few precious seconds to disappear into the fog. The man ducked behind the rocks, reloading, breathing hard. The officer pulled himself up, rage twisting his face. "You'll pay for that," he shouted, lifting his pistol. The man stepped out, standing squarely in the open. "Then come finish it." They stared at each other across the distance, two men shaped by different worlds but bound by the same lawless land. One fought for power, the other for something far more fragile: mercy. The officer raised his gun, and the world seemed to still. Far away, the woman heard the shot echo through the canyon. It was impossible to tell who had fired or who had fallen. She rode harder, tears streaming down her face, her hands clenched on the reins. The river ahead gleamed faintly under the weak light, winding toward the mountains. She could still hear distant shouting, then silence. Only the sound of the wind and her heartbeat remained. Behind her, smoke began to rise where the gunfire had been. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the pause before the storm's final blow. As the sun broke through the clouds, its light touched the valley and the rough, empty plain beyond. The woman stopped her horse on the ridge and looked back. Somewhere out there behind the veil of morning haze, the man's ranch stood, small, lonely, and still. She thought of his boy, waiting by the fire, asking when his father would return. Her throat tightened as she whispered a promise to the wind. She would not let his sacrifice be for nothing. She would find a way to make it right, but deep down she knew the officer wasn't finished. The shot she heard might have struck one of them, but not enough to end what had started. The chase wasn't over. It was changing, turning into something far greater than either of them had expected. The woman spurred her horse forward, disappearing into the wilderness once more, the echo of that single gunshot chasing her like a ghost across the wide, unforgiving land. The sun was setting when the woman finally reached the open plains beyond the canyon. The sky stretched wide and red, fading slowly into violet, the color of quiet endings. Her horse was exhausted, its sides flecked with foam. But she didn't stop until she was sure no sound of pursuit followed her. The land here was still untouched by gunfire or smoke. Only the whisper of the wind moved through the tall grass. She dismounted slowly, her legs trembling, and turned to look back one last time. Somewhere behind those ridges, the man she had left behind had stood against the law to save her. She didn't know if he lived or fell, but the thought of him filled her chest with something that felt like both grief and strength. She found a hollow near the riverbank and built a small fire from driftwood. The flames caught slow, their light trembling like a heartbeat. She took out the little silver trinket she carried, the broken charm that once belonged to her son, and held it near the fire. It glinted faintly, as if remembering another time. She whispered the boy's name and thought of her husband's face, then of the man who had risked everything to give her another chance at life. The night around her was cold, but she felt warmth rise from that single memory, the warmth of a stranger's kindness in a world that had forgotten mercy. At dawn, she continued west, following the river as he had told her. Days passed, one after another, through scrubland and stony trails. The wound on her arm healed slowly. She saw no riders, no soldiers, only the distant hawks circling above. On the third day, she found the old trading post he had mentioned, half hidden among willows. The building leaned sideways, its roof patched with tin, but smoke drifted from the chimney. When she called out, an old man stepped outside, wiping his hands on a cloth. His beard was gray, his eyes sharp despite the years. "You look like you've ridden a long way," he said. "What brings you here?" She hesitated before answering. "A friend sent me. He said you might help." The old man frowned slightly. "What friend?" She told him the rancher's name, the man who had taken her in for one night and stood against soldiers to protect her. The trader's face softened as soon as he heard it. "So you're the woman," he said quietly. "He came through here 2 winters ago. Spoke little, worked hard. Never could forget the past, that one. He was a good man." Her throat tightened. "Was?" she asked carefully. The old man nodded slowly. "Word came down last week. There was trouble near his ranch. Said he fought off a group of men, saved his boy but took a bullet doing it. Died 2 days later. They buried him by the cottonwoods near his home." The woman's breath caught. For a long time she couldn't speak. The trader watched her silently, understanding more from her silence than words could tell. "He saved me," she whispered finally. "He didn't even know who I was, but he saved me." The trader nodded again. "That sounds like him." She looked out toward the west where the horizon burned with sunlight. Grief settled in her chest, heavy but clean, the kind that no longer crushed but reminded her she was still alive. "He said you owed him a favor," she said after a moment. "He wanted me to find safety here." The trader gestured toward the barn. "Then you'll stay as long as you need. There's room and work if you want it. Nobody asked questions here?" She thanked him quietly and stepped inside the small shelter behind the post. That night, as she lay beneath a rough wool blanket, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of the ranch, the flicker of firelight on his face, his boy's laughter, the sound of his voice when he said she'd be safe. The world had taken much from her, but this one man had given her something back, hope. Weeks passed, and she worked at the trading post, tending to the horses and helping with supplies. Travelers came and went, miners, ranchers, soldiers passing through, and each time she heard talk of lawmen searching the hills, her heart would tense. But no one ever spoke her name again. The officer who had hunted her was gone, his trail cold. Some said he'd resigned after the incident near the ranch. Others whispered he'd been wounded and left the territory altogether. She didn't care to know which was true. The land had a way of settling its own debts. One morning, as spring came early, she stood by the river watching the sunrise. The sound of hooves approached from the trail. A young boy rode up on a small bay horse, his hat too big for his head, his eyes bright with curiosity. She froze. He looked no older than 8. When he stopped in front of her, she knew him instantly. The same clear gaze, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. "You're her, ain't you?" he said softly. She nodded slowly. "Who told you that?" "Pa did," the boy said. "Before he died, he told me about an Apache woman he helped. Said if I ever met her, I should tell her thank you." Tears blurred her vision. "Thank me? For what?" "For giving him something to believe in again," the boy replied. "He said the night you came to our door was the first time he stopped feeling alone." Her hands trembled as she reached out and rested them lightly on his shoulder. "Your father was the bravest man I've ever known," the boy smiled a little. "He told me to find you when I was old enough to ride. Said you'd probably head west. He said you'd understand why he couldn't let the soldiers win." She nodded, her eyes wet. "I understand," she said softly. "Better than anyone." The boy looked down at the small bag hanging from his saddle. "I brought something for you." He opened it and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. When he handed it to her, she unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving of a horse, simple but finely made. "Pa carved that," the boy said. "Said it was meant for you." Her fingers traced the rough edges of the carving, her heart aching with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood together in the rising light, 2 lives tied by one man's sacrifice. After a while, the boy said he had to ride back before sunset. She watched him go until he disappeared over the hill, his figure small against the open land. When he was gone, she looked down at the carving again. It wasn't perfect, but it carried the warmth of a human hand, the kind of thing made not for money or pride, but for remembrance. That night, she built another small fire by the river. The stars came out bright and unbroken. She took out the carving and the little silver trinket and set them together near the flames. They gleamed side by side, one a gift of the past, the other a promise of what still remained. She thought of all the miles she had run, all the fear and pain that had driven her. For the first time, she didn't feel hunted anymore. She wasn't just a fugitive or a widow or a woman who had lost everything. She was someone who had been saved, and in that saving, she had learned what freedom really meant. The next morning, she packed her few belongings and saddled the horse the trader had given her. Before leaving, she carved a small mark on one of the wooden beams near the river, a symbol from her people meaning safe passage. Then she turned her horse toward the west. As she rode away, the wind picked up across the plains, carrying the scent of grass and the faint echo of a voice she would never hear again. She didn't look back this time. The past had done enough looking for her. In the distance, the land opened into gold and blue, the promise of a new life waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. She rode steady, her heart lighter than it had been in years, knowing that somewhere under the wide American sky, a good man's memory still walked beside her, and though his grave lay far behind, his kindness had already reached farther than any law, farther than any fear, carved forever into the heart of a woman who had once been hunted, but now rode free.